The morning had started like any other for Claire. Her townhouse was quiet, save for the faint hum of her espresso machine brewing her second cup of the day. The muted tones of her decor, a calculated palette of whites, grays, and the occasional pop of navy, reflected her personality, organized, efficient, and entirely in control. She was already dressed for her first meeting, her blazer perfectly pressed, her hair swept back in a no-nonsense ponytail. She reached for her phone, scanning through emails while her Bluetooth headset chirped with a reminder about an upcoming call. Just as she adjusted her coffee cup in one hand, the doorbell rang. Claire paused, frowning slightly. It wasn't unusual for packages to arrive early, but this felt oddly timed. She placed her cup down and strode toward the door, mentally running through the day's schedule. When she opened the door, she didn't see a delivery box. Instead, there was a baby carrier, its straps snugly enclosing a small bundle. Claire blinked, certain her mind was playing tricks. She took a hesitant step forward, her gaze landing on the tiny face peeking out from a soft pink blanket. The baby's wide, unfocused eyes were the kind that belonged to someone new to the world, and her tiny fist wriggled out to grab at the air. Beside her, a folded piece of paper fluttered slightly in the morning breeze. Claire crouched down, her breath catching as she reached for the note. Her hand trembled as she unfolded the paper and read the hastily scrawled words, "Her name is Mia. You're her aunt. Please take care of her." For a moment, Claire forgot to breathe. She stood, clutching the paper as though it might hold some deeper explanation if she stared long enough. Her mind immediately went to Jessica. Jessica. The name dropped into her consciousness like a stone in still water. She hadn't spoken to her sister in years. Jessica, with her unpredictable choices and chaotic lifestyle, had drifted far from the family orbit, leaving Claire to assume she'd never find her way back. And yet, here was this baby, a tangible, undeniable link to her estranged sister. The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper that jolted Claire back to reality. Panic surged. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, pacing her entryway as she tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. Her voice was steady but laced with urgency, the words tumbling out in a rush. "There's a baby, on my doorstep. A note says I'm the aunt. I don't know what to do. Can someone come and take her?" Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived. Their reassuring presence did little to calm Claire, who stood on the threshold of her immaculate home, arms crossed tightly as she watched them inspect the carrier and read the note. "Do you know anyone who might have left the baby here?" one of the officers asked. "My sister," Claire replied, her voice clipped. "But I haven't seen her in years. I don't even know where she is." She gestured toward the baby. "I can't, this isn't something I can handle. I don't know anything about babies." The officers exchanged a look before nodding. "We'll notify Child Protective Services," one of them said. "They'll take custody of the child while they investigate." Claire nodded quickly, relief washing over her. She retreated into the house while the officers stayed outside with the baby, making calls and documenting the scene. She tried to distract herself, picking up her coffee cup and sipping absent-mindedly. But the taste had gone bitter, and she set it down with a grimace. A short time later, a CPS worker arrived. The woman, dressed in a practical cardigan and carrying a clipboard, approached Claire with a professional but gentle demeanor. She introduced herself and explained the process in a calm voice, though Claire barely registered the words. She just wanted this over with. The woman crouched to pick up the baby, adjusting the blanket with practiced care. The baby stirred again, letting out a small, gurgling sound as she was lifted from the carrier. Claire found herself staring, unable to look away. "This will be temporary while we locate the mother or other relatives," the CPS worker assured her. "If you remember anything that might help us, please don't hesitate to reach out." Claire nodded stiffly, her hands gripping the doorframe as she watched the woman carry the baby down the steps and into a waiting car. The vehicle pulled away, the sound of its engine fading into the distance. She closed the door and leaned against it, her forehead pressed to the cool wood. Relief coursed through her, relief that someone else was now responsible, that she could return to her life as planned. Claire wasn't heartless, but she was practical. This wasn't her problem to solve. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of calls and emails, but Claire found herself more distracted than usual. She had always prided herself on her focus, on her ability to compartmentalize and tackle challenges head-on. But now, she couldn't shake the image of the baby's wide eyes or the soft sound of her whimper. By mid-afternoon, Claire was seated at her desk, staring blankly at her laptop. The screen displayed a spreadsheet she was supposed to be updating, but her mind kept drifting. She thought about Jessica, her rebellious streak, her laughter, her fiery independence. And then she thought about the last time they had spoken. It had been years ago, a brief and strained phone call that ended in frustration on both sides. Claire had told herself it was better this way, that some bridges were meant to stay burned. But now, questions she had avoided for years began to surface. Where was Jessica? Why had she left the baby with Claire? And why had she disappeared so completely? Claire shook her head, willing herself to focus. The CPS worker would handle it. They were trained for this kind of thing. She was just a stop on the way. Nothing more. Yet, despite her rationalizations, she couldn't escape the uneasy feeling settling in her chest. That evening, as Claire prepared for bed, she walked past the entryway where the baby carrier had sat only hours earlier. The space was empty now, but she could still see it in her mind's eye, the crinkled note and the soft pink blanket etched into her memory. She paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. For the first time in years, she thought of Jessica not with anger or frustration but with something closer to regret. She pushed the feeling aside and turned off the lights, retreating to the quiet sanctuary of her bedroom. Her life would go on, just as it always had. But deep down, Claire knew that something had shifted. She just didn't know what it meant yet. The next morning, Claire sat at her desk in her home office, staring at her laptop. Her calendar was packed, as always, with meetings, calls, and deadlines. The polished veneer of her life, a world of carefully scheduled precision, should have been enough to pull her back into rhythm. But as she stared at the blinking cursor in her email draft, her thoughts wandered, slipping through cracks she hadn't realized were there. Jessica. The name came to her again, unbidden and persistent. It had been years since Claire allowed herself to think about her sister for longer than a fleeting moment. Their relationship was a messy, tangled thread she had long ago decided to snip. At least, that's what she had told herself. She reached for her coffee, hoping the familiar bitterness would ground her, but the cup was cold. With a sigh, she pushed back from her desk and wandered into the kitchen. As she stood by the sink, her gaze fell on the window overlooking her neatly trimmed backyard. For a moment, she wasn't there. She was 13 again, watching Jessica climb out of their bedroom window onto the garage roof, laughing as she disappeared into the night with her friends. Always one for dramatic exits, Jessica would reappear hours later, unapologetic and defiant. Claire shook her head, her grip tightening on the ceramic mug. Her sister had always been like that, reckless, unpredictable, impossible to pin down. And Claire had been the opposite, the reliable one, the responsible one. Their parents had come to expect it from her. She had been the anchor while Jessica drifted further and further out to sea. The sharp ring of her phone jolted her back to the present. She didn't recognize the number, so she let it go to voicemail. It wasn't until the ringing stopped that she realized her heart was racing. She exhaled slowly, setting the mug on the counter before returning to her desk. She threw herself into her work, answering emails and jumping on a video call, but the distraction was thin and brittle. As the hours dragged on, the image of the baby on her doorstep refused to leave her mind. She kept thinking of those wide, unknowing eyes and the note with its uneven handwriting. The words haunted her, "You're her aunt." The phrase made her stomach twist. How could Jessica do something like this? How could she drop a baby, a human being, into Claire's lap without so much as a warning? And yet, the anger was tinged with something softer, something harder to name. Worry? Regret? A whisper of the connection they once had? That evening, Claire called her mother. They spoke sparingly these days, their conversations polite and perfunctory. Claire hesitated as she listened to the phone ring, wondering how much she should say. When her mother answered, Claire tried to keep her tone light, asking about her parents' week before easing into the real reason for her call. "Mom," she began, her voice tightening. "Do you know anything about Jessica? Where she's been? What she's been doing?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When her mother finally spoke, her voice was careful, tinged with the sadness of someone who had asked herself the same questions for years. "No. Not for a long time." Claire felt her frustration rise, but she tamped it down. I was reminded of her recently, that's all." Her mother hesitated again, then sighed. "Jessica was always a free spirit. I suppose we knew she'd go her own way eventually." Claire bristled. Free spirit. That was how their parents had always framed it, as though Jessica's wild streak were some charming quirk instead of the cause of so much strain. But Claire knew better. She remembered the shouting matches, the slammed doors, the nights spent covering for Jessica when she snuck out or skipped school. "Yeah," Claire said finally, her tone clipped. "I guess so." She ended the call soon after, her mother's vague answers doing little to soothe the knot in her chest. Claire leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The memories came anyway, unbidden and insistent. She remembered the summer Jessica left for good. They'd fought over something stupid, Claire couldn't even remember what. But she could still picture the way Jessica looked as she stood in the driveway with her battered backpack slung over one shoulder. Her sister's expression had been equal parts defiant and vulnerable, a mixture that was so quintessentially Jessica it made Claire's heart ache to recall it. "I can't stay here anymore," Jessica had said, her voice low and steady. "You mean you don't want to stay?" Claire had snapped. Jessica hadn't replied. She had just turned and walked away, leaving Claire standing there with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. At the time, she had told herself it was for the best. Jessica was impossible to reason with, always pulling everyone else into her chaos. Claire had a future to think about, a carefully planned future that didn't have room for her sister's messes. But now, years later, the memory didn't feel as satisfying as it once had. There was no sense of vindication, no certainty that she had been right. Instead, there was only the nagging feeling that she had let Jessica slip away when she might have done more to hold on. Claire rubbed her temples, willing the thoughts to stop. She needed to focus, to regain the control that had always been her lifeline. She pulled her laptop closer, scrolling through her to-do list in an effort to ground herself. But even as she typed out an email to her marketing team, her mind wandered back to Jessica. She thought of the times they had shared as kids, before everything went wrong. The late-night pillow fights, the whispered secrets under a blanket fort, the way Jessica used to make her laugh so hard her sides ached. Those memories felt distant now, like an old photograph faded by time. Claire closed her laptop with a sigh, realizing the futility of trying to work through the noise in her head. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city lights that glittered in the distance. Somewhere out there, Jessica had made a life for herself, a life Claire knew nothing about. And now, that life had intersected with hers in the most unexpected way. Claire couldn't ignore it, no matter how much she wanted to. The guilt she had buried for years was beginning to surface, and it was heavier than she remembered. She had spent so much time building her own world, carving out her own success, that she had pushed aside the messy, complicated reality of her family. But now, faced with the mystery of her sister's disappearance and the presence of a child she had never expected, Claire realized that the past wasn't as distant as she had hoped. It lingered, waiting for her to confront it. And whether she liked it or not, the time for ignoring it was over. Claire awoke to the sound of her alarm, the usual chirping melody that signaled another tightly scheduled day. But instead of rising immediately, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The baby was gone. The authorities had taken her away to be cared for by someone better equipped for the task, and Claire had been more than relieved at the time. Yet now, a strange unease had settled over her, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. Her mornings were usually a precise dance of efficiency, from the perfectly measured pour of her coffee to the way she scanned her inbox while brushing her teeth. Today, however, her focus was scattered. Her emails blurred together, the buzz of incoming notifications felt intrusive, and her mind kept wandering back to the baby. Or, more specifically, to Jessica. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. She had done the responsible thing, handing over the child to professionals who would sort everything out. But as she sat at her desk and stared at her laptop, she found herself wondering about the unanswered questions that had been trailing her since the baby arrived. Where was Jessica? Why had she left the baby on Claire's doorstep? And why hadn't she come herself? Claire shut her laptop and leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't like her. She thrived on clarity and order, on checking tasks off her list and meeting her goals. But now, it felt as though someone had thrown a wrench into the carefully constructed machine of her life, and she didn't know how to fix it. By mid-afternoon, Claire had given up any pretense of working. Her mind was too restless to focus. She grabbed her coat and keys, driven by a need to do something, anything, to shake the unease that clung to her like a shadow. Without a clear plan, she found herself driving to the nearest police station. The station was bustling with activity, the low hum of voices and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards filling the air. Claire approached the front desk, feeling slightly out of place in her tailored coat and heels. A young officer greeted her, his expression polite but distracted. "I'm looking for information about someone," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "My sister. Her name is Jessica." The officer asked a few questions, jotting down notes as she spoke. When she explained about the baby and the note, he nodded thoughtfully but offered little reassurance. "We can file a missing person report," he said. "But if she's an adult and hasn't committed a crime, there's not much we can do unless she's in immediate danger." Claire left the station feeling deflated but not deterred. If the police couldn't help her, she would find another way. She thought of all the places Jessica might have been, the places someone with nowhere else to go might turn to. It was a long shot, but it was better than sitting at home and wondering. Her next stop was the hospital. She approached the reception desk with the same determination, explaining her situation to a receptionist who listened patiently before directing her to a social worker. The woman, a calm and empathetic presence, asked thoughtful questions as she took notes. "Jessica could have come through here," the social worker said, her tone measured. "But without more information, it's hard to say for sure. I can tell you that many people in similar situations end up at local shelters. It might be worth checking there." Claire thanked her and left, clutching the list of shelter addresses the social worker had given her. The thought of Jessica living in a shelter was jarring, a stark contrast to the sister she remembered. Jessica had always been restless, always chasing something bigger, brighter, and more exciting than the life their family had offered. Claire had never imagined her ending up like this, lost, unreachable, and burdened with a child she couldn't care for. The first shelter she visited was small and crowded, its walls lined with bulletin boards covered in flyers for support groups and job postings. A volunteer greeted her with a warm smile, listening as Claire explained her search. "We've had a lot of people come through here," the volunteer said gently. "I can check our records, but if she didn't leave her full name, it might be hard to find anything." Claire waited as the volunteer disappeared into a back office, her heart pounding in her chest. When the woman returned, she shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry. I didn't find anything under Jessica's name." Undeterred, Claire moved on to the next shelter, and then the next. Each visit brought a similar mixture of hope and frustration, the possibility of answers slipping through her fingers like water. By the time she reached the fourth shelter, her energy was waning, but her resolve was as strong as ever. This shelter was larger than the others, with a bustling common area and a steady stream of people coming and going. Claire approached the front desk, rehearsing her explanation in her head as she waited for the receptionist to finish a phone call. When it was her turn, she spoke quickly but clearly, outlining her search for Jessica and the events that had led her here. The receptionist's expression softened as she listened. "You might want to speak to Karen," she said, gesturing toward a door at the end of the hall. "She's one of our caseworkers. She might know something." Karen was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened carefully as Claire explained her situation, occasionally nodding as she took notes. When Claire finished, Karen sat back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "I do remember a Jessica," she said slowly. "She came through here a few times. I think she was pregnant the last time I saw her." Claire's breath caught. "Do you know where she went? Or if she said anything about me?" Karen shook her head. "She didn't leave much information. But I remember she seemed tired. Like she'd been through a lot. We tried to help her as much as we could, but sometimes people slip through the cracks." The words hit Claire harder than she expected, a mix of guilt and sorrow rising in her chest. She thanked Karen and left the shelter, her mind racing with everything she had learned. Jessica had been here. She had been pregnant. And now she was gone, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a baby who didn't yet know the depth of her mother's struggles. As Claire drove home, the weight of it all settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had spent so many years distancing herself from Jessica's chaos, building walls to protect her own carefully curated life. But now, those walls felt fragile, like they might crumble under the weight of everything she had ignored. For the first time in years, Claire allowed herself to feel the full force of her sister's absence. It wasn't just a gap in her life, it was a wound that had never fully healed. And now, with the baby's arrival and the trail of clues Jessica had left behind, Claire knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. The shelter smelled faintly of disinfectant and damp clothing, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the staff who greeted Claire as she walked in. The space was crowded but orderly, with mismatched chairs scattered around tables where a few people sat, eating or talking quietly. A volunteer offered her a cup of coffee, but Claire declined, clutching her coat tightly around herself as if it could shield her from the unfamiliar atmosphere. She felt out of place in her tailored blazer and boots, an interloper in a world she had never dared to step into before. Karen, the caseworker she had spoken to earlier, waved her over to a small office tucked into the corner of the building. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their surfaces cluttered with stacks of paper and the occasional framed photo. Karen gestured for Claire to sit, her expression kind but wary. "I looked through our records again," Karen began, settling into her chair. "Jessica stayed here several times over the past year. She didn't talk much about her situation, but it was clear she was struggling. She was pregnant the last time we saw her, about 6 weeks ago." Claire swallowed hard. She could picture Jessica in this room, sitting in the same chair, her belly rounded with the baby who had been left on her doorstep. It was a strange, surreal image, one that felt impossibly distant and painfully close all at once. "Did she say where she was going?" Claire asked, her voice tighter than she intended. Karen shook her head. "No. That was typical of her. She came and went, never staying long. We tried to connect her with resources, but," she hesitated, searching for the right words. Jessica seemed like someone who was used to relying on herself, even when it wasn't working. Claire's chest tightened. It sounded exactly like her sister, stubborn, self-reliant, and fiercely independent, even to her own detriment. "She must have been desperate to leave the baby with me," Claire murmured. Karen nodded. "Desperation can make people do things they wouldn't normally do. But it also means she trusted you, in her own way. The words landed heavily, a mix of comfort and guilt. Trust was a fragile thing, and Claire wasn't sure she had earned it. With Karen's help, Claire began piecing together fragments of Jessica's life. The shelter had records of her stays, but they painted a scattered, incomplete picture. Jessica had spent time at other shelters in the area, each stay lasting only a few days or weeks before she moved on. There were gaps in her timeline, months where she seemed to vanish entirely. Karen introduced Claire to a few of the other staff members, who remembered Jessica in bits and pieces. One recalled her sense of humor, a dry wit that sometimes caught people off guard. Another described her as fiercely protective of her unborn child, even when she had nothing to give. A third mentioned that she often kept to herself, avoiding the communal areas when she could. She was proud, one staff member said, her voice tinged with sadness. Too proud to ask for help, even when she needed it most. Claire thanked them all and left the office with a growing weight in her chest. She had always thought of Jessica as reckless and impulsive, but now she saw another side of her, a side shaped by hardship and survival, by choices made in the face of impossible circumstances. Determined to learn more, Claire began reaching out to people who might have known Jessica. Karen had suggested a few places where she might find others who had crossed paths with her sister. It was an uncomfortable task, but Claire pushed through her discomfort, driven by a need to understand. She met a woman named Linda at a soup kitchen, who remembered Jessica from a winter night months ago. Linda described Jessica as kind but guarded, quick to help others but reluctant to accept help herself. Another man, a street artist named Victor, recalled seeing Jessica at a park, her belly swollen as she sketched quietly on a bench. She didn't say much, Victor told Claire. But she had this look about her, like she was carrying the weight of the world. I gave her a sandwich once. She thanked me, but you could tell she didn't want to take it. Each story added another layer to the picture, one that Claire could barely reconcile with the sister she had known. She felt the sting of regret more sharply with every word, every memory shared by these strangers who had known Jessica in ways she hadn't. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation with a woman who had shared a shelter bunk with Jessica, Claire found herself sitting in her car, staring at the dashboard. The guilt was overwhelming, a relentless ache that had been growing since the moment she opened her door to find the baby on her porch. She had spent so many years distancing herself from Jessica, focusing on her career and her carefully ordered life. It was easier that way, to build walls and tell herself that Jessica's choices were her own. But now, faced with the reality of her sister's struggles, those walls felt like cowardice. Claire couldn't stop picturing Jessica, alone, pregnant, moving from shelter to shelter with nowhere to call home. She thought of all the times she could have reached out, all the calls she could have made, all the chances she had to reconnect. And she thought of the baby, left in her care as a final, desperate plea for help. The pieces were beginning to come together, but they formed a picture that Claire wasn't sure she was ready to see. Jessica's life had been hard, harder than Claire had ever imagined. And somewhere along the way, they had both lost each other in the chaos. But now, with each step she took, Claire felt the pull of something stronger than guilt, something closer to determination. She couldn't change the past, but she could try to find the answers that Jessica had left behind. She started the car and pulled onto the street, the city lights blurring in the distance as she drove. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Claire wasn't afraid to follow it. Claire sat in the dimly lit diner, her fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking. The lead she had been given that morning had brought her to this out-of-the-way spot on the edge of town, a place where the chipped paint on the walls and the sticky vinyl seats told a story of resilience. Across the table sat a woman named Louise, whose frail hands trembled slightly as she reached for her own cup of tea. Louise was older than Claire had expected, her thin frame draped in a coat that seemed 2 sizes too big. Her hair, once vibrant, had dulled to a soft gray, and her voice wavered when she spoke. But her eyes were sharp, and they locked onto Claire with an intensity that made her feel like a child again, being scolded by a stern teacher. "You're Jessica's sister," Louise said, the statement more a confirmation than a question. "Yes," Claire replied, her voice steady but soft. "I've been trying to piece together what happened. People said you might know something." Louise nodded slowly, her hands curling around the mug as if it were the only thing anchoring her. "Jessica talked about you all the time," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "She said you were smart. Ambitious. Someone who had it all figured out." Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't expected this, a reminder of how Jessica had seen her, even after all the years of silence between them. Louise sighed, leaning back in her seat. "She came to me about 2 months ago," she began. "She was pregnant, barely holding herself together. I'd seen her around before, but that time was different. She was tired, scared. She told me she didn't have anyone left except for you." The words landed heavily, each one a blow to Claire's carefully constructed sense of detachment. She had spent so long convincing herself that Jessica's life was separate from hers, that her sister's choices were beyond her control. But now, sitting across from this woman who had witnessed Jessica's struggles firsthand, she felt that argument unraveling. "She stayed with me for a few weeks," Louise continued. "I did what I could. Gave her a bed, some food. But she didn't want to be a burden. She was always talking about the baby, how she wanted her to have a better life, a chance to grow up safe and loved." Claire's grip on the coffee mug tightened, her knuckles white. "What happened to her?" she asked, the question barely more than a whisper. Louise hesitated, her expression clouding with sorrow. "She went into labor early," she said finally. "It was a rough delivery. She held on just long enough to bring that baby into the world. But she didn't have any ID, and by the time the authorities got involved, it was too late to find her family." Claire's breath hitched, the air seeming to leave her lungs all at once. She had braced herself for bad news, but this was a finality she hadn't been prepared for. Jessica was gone. The realization swept over her like a tidal wave, pulling her under and leaving her gasping for air. "She died?" Claire asked, her voice breaking. Louise nodded, her own eyes glistening. "She died," she said simply. "But before she did, she told me about you. She said you were the one person she could trust, the only one who could give her baby a real chance." Claire's chest ached, the weight of her guilt pressing down harder than ever. She thought of all the times she could have reached out, all the moments when she could have picked up the phone or written a letter. But she hadn't. She had told herself it wasn't her responsibility, that Jessica didn't want her help. "She trusted me," Claire said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "She loved you," Louise said firmly. "Even after everything, she still believed in you. That's why I brought the baby to you. I thought you'd want to know." Claire's vision blurred, tears welling up despite her efforts to hold them back. She looked down at her hands, at the faint tremor in her fingers, and felt the full weight of her sister's faith in her. It was almost unbearable, this mixture of love and regret, of loss and missed opportunities. "I should have done more," Claire said, her voice trembling. "I should have tried harder to find her, to help her." Louise reached across the table, her thin hand resting gently on Claire's. "You can't change the past," she said, her voice steady despite its frailty. "But you can honor her now. You can give that little girl the life Jessica wanted for her." Claire nodded slowly, the tears spilling over as she tried to steady her breathing. She thought of the baby, Mia, her tiny hands and wide, curious eyes. She thought of Jessica's last moments, of the strength it must have taken to bring that child into the world despite everything. For the first time, Claire saw her sister not as the reckless, impulsive girl she had been, but as a woman who had faced unimaginable challenges and made the ultimate sacrifice for her child. "I'll take care of her," Claire said, her voice firmer now. "I'll do whatever it takes." Louise smiled faintly, her expression softening. Jessica knew you would, she said. That's why she trusted you. As Claire left the diner, the weight of her grief and guilt was still there, but it felt different now. It wasn't something she could bury or ignore. It was something she would carry with her, a reminder of the sister she had lost and the responsibility she had been given. She stepped out into the cold evening air, her breath visible in the glow of the streetlights. The world around her felt sharper, more vivid, as if her grief had stripped away the layers of detachment she had built over the years. Jessica was gone, but her love for her daughter, and for Claire, was something that would endure. And now, it was up to Claire to ensure that love was honored, that Mia would have the life her mother had dreamed of. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges Claire couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose that went beyond her career or her meticulously ordered life. It was messy and complicated, but it was hers. And she wouldn't turn away from it again. The morning light streamed through the windows of Claire's townhouse as she sat at her kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of her. The weight of the past few days pressed heavily on her, like an anchor tied to her chest. Her thoughts were consumed by Jessica, her sister's struggles, her love for her daughter, and the trust she had placed in Claire to give the baby a better life. Mia's tiny face filled her mind, her wide, unknowing eyes and soft coos. The memory of the baby's weight in her arms lingered, a bittersweet ache that refused to fade. Claire had spent the last few days trying to reconcile her guilt with the overwhelming reality of what lay ahead. Jessica had entrusted her with something precious, and the more Claire thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't walk away from that responsibility. She picked up her phone and dialed the number for Child Protective Services. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, asking a series of questions as Claire explained her intentions. Each answer felt like a step forward, like a small piece of penance for the years she had spent disconnected from her sister. "I want to begin the adoption process," Claire said finally, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "She deserves a home, and I want to give her that." The CPS worker took down her information, explaining the process in detail. There would be interviews, home visits, paperwork, steps that would take time and patience. But Claire didn't flinch. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of clarity, a certainty that this was the right thing to do. She spent the next few days preparing. She cleared out the spare room that had once been her home office, envisioning it as a nursery. She researched parenting books, scrolling through endless articles about feeding schedules, sleep routines, and milestones. It was overwhelming, but the thought of Mia kept her going. When the CPS worker arrived for the first home visit, Claire was nervous but determined. She answered every question honestly, explaining her relationship with Jessica and her commitment to raising Mia in a loving, stable environment. She spoke about her career, her home, and the steps she was taking to prepare for motherhood. The worker nodded thoughtfully, jotting down notes as Claire spoke. "You're taking on a big responsibility," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Are you ready for this?" Claire met her gaze, her shoulders squared. "I don't know if anyone is ever completely ready," she admitted. "But I want to do this. For Mia. And for Jessica." The worker gave her a small, encouraging smile before continuing with her checklist. That evening, Claire sat on the floor of the nursery, surrounded by the remnants of her old office. The room was bare now, its walls ready for a fresh coat of paint and the arrival of a crib. She ran her fingers over the carpet, her thoughts drifting to Jessica once again. She had missed so much, so many chances to reconnect, to help her sister when she needed it most. But this was her chance to make things right. Jessica might be gone, but her daughter was here, and Claire was determined to honor her sister's memory by giving Mia the life she deserved. A few days later, Claire received a call from CPS. She answered eagerly, expecting an update on the adoption process. Instead, the voice on the other end was cautious. "We've located the baby's biological father," the worker said. The words hit Claire like a punch to the stomach. She sat down heavily on the edge of her couch, gripping the phone tightly. "The father?" she echoed, her voice faltering. "Yes," the worker confirmed. "He came forward recently after hearing about the situation. He's willing to meet with us to discuss his rights and what role he might want to play in the child's life." Claire's mind raced. She hadn't expected this, hadn't even considered the possibility. Jessica had never mentioned the father in any of the stories Claire had heard from the shelter staff or the people she had spoken to. The baby had felt like a connection solely between her and Jessica, a bond forged in love and loss. "What happens now?" Claire asked, her voice quieter. "We'll be scheduling a meeting," the worker explained. "It's important to determine his intentions and whether he wants to be involved in the baby's life. We'll keep you informed as things progress." Claire hung up the phone, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of emotions. The idea of someone else stepping in, someone who hadn't been there for Jessica or Mia until now, felt like a betrayal of everything she had been working toward. But at the same time, she knew this wasn't just about her. She sat in silence for a long time, the weight of this new complication settling over her. She had made a promise, to herself, to Jessica, and to Mia. And she wasn't going to back down, no matter what lay ahead. Claire waited at a small cafe downtown, her fingers drumming softly against the edge of the table. The CPS worker had arranged the meeting, and Claire had spent the past few days imagining every possible scenario. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she doubted it would bring much comfort. The idea of meeting the man who had fathered Mia, and by extension played a part in Jessica's final chapter, felt surreal. When he walked in, Claire recognized him immediately. His tailored suit and polished shoes set him apart from the other patrons, and he carried himself with an air of practiced confidence. He scanned the room before approaching her table, extending a hand. "Claire, I presume," he said, his tone polite but detached. She nodded, shaking his hand briefly. "Yes. And you're?" "Mark Bennett," he replied, taking the seat across from her. "Thank you for meeting with me." Claire studied him, trying to piece together the man Jessica had known. He was handsome in a conventional way, with neatly styled hair and the kind of smooth demeanor that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. But there was something guarded in his eyes, as if this meeting was a chore he wanted to finish quickly. "I wasn't sure what to expect," Claire began, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "Why don't you tell me how you knew Jessica?" Mark sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We met at a party. It was a while ago. She was vibrant, fun. Different from the people I usually meet." He hesitated, glancing away briefly. "It was a brief relationship, nothing serious. I didn't even know she was pregnant until CPS reached out." Claire's jaw tightened. "You didn't know? Or you didn't care to find out?" Mark flinched slightly at her tone but didn't argue. "Look, I'm not here to defend myself. I didn't handle things well, and I regret that. But I have a family, a wife, 2 kids, and I can't disrupt their lives." Claire felt a flash of anger rise in her chest. "Disrupt their lives? Do you have any idea what Jessica went through? She was homeless, pregnant, and alone, and you're worried about your image?" Mark's expression hardened. "I know I failed her. I didn't reach out when I should have, and I can't change that now. But I'm here to do what I can for the baby. I'm willing to provide financial support, enough to make sure she's well taken care of. I just can't be involved beyond that." Claire stared at him, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "You think money is enough? That you can write a check and walk away, as if that erases your responsibility?" "I don't have a choice," he shot back, his voice low but firm. "My wife doesn't know about this, and if she finds out, it could destroy my family. I'm trying to do the right thing without causing more harm." Claire took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "This isn't just about you," she said, her voice softer but no less determined. "Mia is going to grow up one day. She'll have questions about where she came from, about who her parents were. Don't you think she deserves to know the truth? Mark hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. For a moment, the confident mask slipped, and Claire saw something closer to guilt. What do you want from me? He asked finally. I want you to acknowledge her, Claire said. Not now, not in her daily life. But if she comes looking for answers one day, I won't lie to her. I won't hide your identity or pretend you didn't exist. She deserves that much. Mark exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. That's fair, he said after a long pause. I'll agree to that. But for now, I'll provide the financial support and stay out of her life. She's better off with you. Claire nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. It wasn't the resolution she had hoped for, but it was something. She had fought for Mia's future, for her right to know the truth, and she wasn't going to back down. As Mark stood to leave, he paused, his expression thoughtful. For what it's worth, Jessica spoke highly of you. She said you were the strongest person she knew. Claire blinked, the words catching her off guard. Before she could respond, Mark turned and walked out of the cafe, disappearing into the busy street. Claire sat there for a moment, her emotions a complicated mix of anger, sadness, and determination. She thought of Mia, of the life she was working so hard to build for her, and of Jessica, who had always believed in her despite everything. She finished her coffee, stood, and left the cafe, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. But even as she walked to her car, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Mia's future was in her hands, and she was ready to fight for it, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Claire's townhouse had never looked less like itself. The sleek furniture and pristine surfaces were now accented by brightly colored toys, a small bouncy chair in the corner, and an ever-present pile of baby blankets draped across the couch. Her meticulously planned days had given way to a rhythm dictated entirely by Mia. Mornings were a whirlwind of bottles and diaper changes, afternoons filled with quiet naps and the occasional walk in the park. Evenings stretched long with cries and feedings, often ending with Claire collapsing into bed, too tired to care about the streaks of spit up on her favorite sweater. But amid the chaos, Claire found herself smiling more than she ever had before. Mia's giggles, soft and unrestrained, could brighten even the most exhausting day. The baby had a way of pulling Claire out of her own head, of making her pause to marvel at small moments, the way Mia's tiny fingers wrapped around hers, the contented sigh she made when she drifted off to sleep, the wonder in her wide eyes when she noticed something new. Claire's friends and colleagues were astonished by the transformation. The Claire they knew had been all business, a powerhouse of efficiency and ambition. But now, when they called or stopped by, they found her on the floor building block towers or softly humming lullabies. It wasn't just that her priorities had shifted, it was as though her entire world had cracked open, letting in a light she hadn't realized was missing. One rainy afternoon, Claire bundled Mia into her car seat and drove to her parents' house. It had been years since she'd been there, and as she pulled into the familiar driveway, her stomach twisted with nerves. Her relationship with her parents had always been complicated, marked by quiet expectations and unspoken disappointments. Jessica's absence had only deepened the divide, a wound no one knew how to address. When her mother opened the door, her eyes widened at the sight of Claire standing there with Mia in her arms. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then her mother's hand flew to her mouth, and she stepped aside to let them in. Claire set Mia down in her carrier and straightened, brushing rain from her coat. I thought it was time you met your granddaughter, she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. Her father appeared in the doorway to the living room, his expression a mix of confusion and tentative hope. He moved toward Mia slowly, as if afraid she might disappear. She looks just like Jessica did when she was a baby, her mother whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. I know, she said softly. They spent the afternoon together, passing Mia between them as they talked. Claire told them about her search for Jessica, about everything she had learned and the promises she had made. Her parents listened in silence, their faces etched with grief as they absorbed the truth. When Claire finished, her mother reached over and squeezed her hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "For bringing her to us. For keeping her safe." Her father, usually stoic, bent his head and let out a shaky breath. "Jessica would have wanted this," he said quietly. "For her daughter to know she was loved." They spent the rest of the day reminiscing about Jessica, her mischievous smile, her fiery spirit, the way she had always found joy in the smallest things. It was bittersweet, the ache of her absence woven through their laughter. But as they watched Mia sleep in her carrier, a sense of peace settled over the room. In the weeks that followed, Claire's parents became regular visitors, their home gradually filling with baby toys and family photos. Mia's presence seemed to mend the unspoken rift between them, giving them something tangible to hold on to as they grieved Jessica's loss. One crisp autumn afternoon, Claire hosted a small gathering at her home. It was the first time her family had come together in years, and the house buzzed with warmth and laughter. Her parents sat on the couch, watching Mia crawl across the rug while Claire's cousins snapped photos. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Claire stepped outside onto the patio, Mia nestled in her arms. The baby gurgled happily, her tiny hands reaching for the golden leaves fluttering in the breeze. Claire held her close, her heart full in a way she hadn't thought possible. Behind her, the sound of her family's laughter spilled out through the open door, mingling with the crisp air. For the first time in years, Claire felt connected, to them, to Jessica's memory, and to the life she was building for Mia. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was more than enough. She kissed the top of Mia's head, whispering softly, "You're going to be okay, little one. We both are." And for the first time, she truly believed it.